IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I have with me today General Menon and Manoj, and we're going to be discussing China yet again, but we're going to be discussing something a little different. Specifically, we are going to look at what India's military options are against China. And this is inspired by a recent paper published by the Center for New American Security. And it has some pretty interesting recommendations. So I want to get started with you, Manoj. Tell us about the paper. What does it say? What are its core arguments?
Hi. Okay, so the paper broadly talks about what are India's military choices with regard to China, but it begins with a very sort of clear agenda, which is that India is sort of a bulwark against China's broader rise globally, where India can sort of stem China's rise in the Indian Ocean region to begin with. And the US has therefore made a bet on supporting India to do this. And India would therefore be fundamental to US policy globally with regard to China. And that's broadly the premise of the paper. And then it sort of tries to make an assessment of what are India and China's sort of relative strengths and weaknesses along the disputed land boundary and in the maritime domain. And the broad argument that it makes is this, that when it comes to the land boundary, India enjoys a certain advantage, which is eroding. And that's a lot to do with Chinese sort of infrastructure build-up, Chinese defense modernization, not just in terms of organization, but also in terms of equipment and the guns and the planes and all that they've developed. And in the maritime domain, again, they talk about the fact that increasing Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean region, increasing capacity, increasing sort of partnerships under BRI, and also things like the Sinicization of the Pakistani Navy. Those sorts of things are going to change the balance of power in favor of China, but that's still some distance away. And in order to stem this from happening, they essentially recommend a couple of things. One of the big basket of this is that the US needs to be playing a far more active role with India, and India and the US need to work together. And they need to be doing things like joint development of weapon systems. They need to be doing joint development of operational sort of tactical strategy and all those sorts of things they need to be working on. And that's broadly what the paper says. And my interest is also to know what General Menon thinks about this.
Actually, I think one of the presumptions they're making is that we enjoyed a particular advantage in the continental region. That advantage is sort of lessening. I don't know from where does that particular idea come from, because what sort of advantage did we enjoy in the first place? The advantage I can think of is the very geography of the Himalayan border itself, of course, gives us a certain amount of defensive capability to defend ourselves. But the length of the border and the amount of troops which is required to defend it has always been a challenge, apart from the very nature of the altitude and the climatic conditions which prevail there. So I'm not quite sure whether we should presume that we had an advantage and that advantage is becoming less, because what is actually the case is that advantage which we had not exploited it fully earlier. We are trying to exploit it now by raising various military forces, deploying them, acquiring means of mobility and so on. So whether the advantage is lessening or from the previous time, or whether it is narrowing, is a matter of how do you see it was before. I think that we were disadvantaged before. Now, because of certain things which we were doing, probably we were much better off than before. But the argument they are making is that the Chinese pace of, let's say, modernization and development of the infrastructure is much more than we are able to do, and that's probably true up to an extent. But I would think that India, if you really look at it in comparison, is, let's say, better off now than we were 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So I would, seriously doubt the statement on which it's making. And of course, in the maritime domain, the arguments which they make, I think are something which we have, our own strategic thinkers have made before, that is one of our strengths which comes purely from India's the geography and the jutting peninsula into the sea lanes of communications. And the fact that we have these islands, Andaman Nicobar, Lakshadweeps and so on, makes us, there is a potential whereas India's power projection capability can be best effective,
Yeah.
So that point, I think they make it very well. But I'm not quite in agreement with the continental part, where they also suggest that we are becoming, we should, and I think that the fact that India is conscious about the weaknesses we have in the continental area and that we need to develop capability to close in is something which our actions show that we are trying to narrow the gap. It's not that the gap is increasing on that front. It would be, I would think that for the Chinese to actually launch a large force across the Himalayas and expect to sustain it for a long time, it would be not an easy thing for the Chinese to do, even if they want to do it. So the question we should ask ourselves, I think first is, why would the Chinese, without actually resolving Taiwan or the South China Sea issue, get into a big fight with India and claim or capture territory across the Himalayas? Because one of the things which we can and we are capable of doing is actually, if the Chinese were to attempt that, then we could be the spoiler in the larger game.
Yeah.
Because then they would be weak either with Taiwan, or we get weaker with Taiwan, or get weaker with China. Because obviously there would be a certain cost which is to play.
Yeah.
So if you look at the larger picture, to view this purely as a Sino-Indian matter, but I think we need to put it in the larger strategic context that China would probably try and do, even if it wants to, what it wants to do would probably not be about get into that big war which this paper talks about, without first resolving Taiwan and the South China Sea, because we have the power that we can tie them down even for a long time if they come across the Himalayas, which will definitely affect them there. So we can't purely speak in terms of our weakness in the continental area is to be related to what would be Chinese political objectives. And I think what this paper, although it says so, I think one of the capabilities on the continental, this thing, is about why is the continental border important to us? And I think the important to us is that the Chinese, from their point of view, would like to put enough pressure there so that we expend our resources on it. The more resources we expend in continental terms against China would mean that we have less resources to develop a maritime power. So if this is the Chinese game plan, then our strategy would be to make sure that does not happen. And for that, we should, at least in the beginning, at least be prepared continentally for what China is likely to do, which is salami slicing, as the army chief has remarked, bite here, bite there, temporarily, keep us engaged, keep developing more, put more resources into it. Therefore, if you don't see this game plan, and if you follow what they have suggested in this paper, then you would have to have resources for both, which is projection across the Himalayas into the Tibetan plateau, and also become a strong power. I'm afraid we must be clear about one thing, that our resources, at least for the foreseeable future, will not make this possible, that we can be strong in both these areas. So that is a choice which the Indian strategic planners have to take. Unlike what they are suggesting, that we should do both. We would want to do both, but I don't think our resources would allow that. I think, so this paper, which makes this point about keeping an advantage in the continental this thing, I think misses the larger point of where this continental border is in the context of Sino-Indian relationship. And I think that's something which basically they could have seen it separately.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the political context, General, because they do not address it at all in this paper. But to be fair to them, on the continental aspect, they do say that the Chinese have some advantages on the Tibetan plateau and that it's easier to build infrastructure. And they're able to keep troops in reserve and move them to wherever it's needed. They also have the suggestion, which basically they say in case of a large invasion by China, you basically let them, you cede territory and then attrite them when they come in.
Yeah, they talk about the fact that you hold on to
strong points,
some points, and then of course, this is a very generalized statement. It's a 3,000 odd kilometer border. Some places you can do this, some places you can do different. But those are matter of granular detail, which I think we should not get into it. But the larger point, the larger point, and I think they give a final advice in terms of operational concept, that India should not send its mechanized forces into the Tibetan plateau, which is what actually the strike corps was supposed to do. And I would agree with that doesn't make any sense. In fact, it doesn't make any sense for us to try and project military power into the Tibetan plateau because of geography. And the point that Aditya just made, the plateau allows them for lateral lines of communication, which means you can switch forces laterally.
Yeah.
The terrain on our side does not allow that to be possible because there are fingers which come north to south. So we can't actually laterally. He can laterally switch. We can't laterally switch. And therefore, an offensive across this sort of thing where he can laterally switch, it will invariably be disadvantageous to us. So the whole cooperational concept cannot be about planning to deter by actually going across the Himalayas and capture. So that's something which I think the paper does not say that we should not go across the Himalaya, but it certainly makes a point about the mechanized formations doing that. And I think we would agree with that. But, I think with what Aditya just said, the whole issue has to be connected is what are the likely political objectives to be. And in terms of deterrence, the most powerful deterrence does not lie for us in the continent, in the land border. It lies in the maritime domain. And that's probably an area, and they've really given a lot of detail. I would agree with most of what they have said in terms of what we should do, both in terms of the organizational changes. They in fact talk about having 2 maritime commands and developing a very powerful naval force, exploiting Andaman Nicobar, Lakshadweep, and so on. So, and also international cooperation, or seeing about including Diego Garcia with the French in their Reunion Islands and so on. So those points are very much valid, that the space for international cooperation lies in the maritime domain, where there are common interests between various countries and with India. And that is something which we must leverage. But that's not a point which, it's always been obvious. In fact, there are a lot of measures that the Indian government has already been taken and trying to see as to how we can think. So it's not something new. What is probably a little different in this paper is my understanding from what it is, that the Americans feel disappointed, and that comes through with the fact that what they had envisaged as India's role in balancing China has not worked out, or at least its space is sort of questionable, and India has not been able to do what it the Americans thought it could do. And that's where the Americans say that we need to speed it up.
Yeah.
And about the operational concepts and so on, I suppose the fact that we are already in a phase where in the maritime domain there's a lot of international cooperation in terms of maritime domain awareness, intelligence sharing, and so on, and underwater exercises, and so, those are things which are being done. But there is still a lot to do, and I would agree that there's a lot of space here for increasing the pace at which we are doing. And I think one of the things which they must be really disappointed about is about we have not had a joint technology initiative where we have been able to develop something together. And that's been, although we've been trying it out for now more than a decade, but we've really not come out with anything concrete. So that's an area which they seem to be emphasizing, and I would agree with that we should be able to do that. But the other point is that we also feel that buying whole systems from the US or from any other this thing would continue to increase our dependency without our ability to actually become the indigenous manufacturers of that product. So we are very wary of that, and that has slowed this whole process of imbibing technology and so on. And the next question is, how does the Indian Armed Forces get their equipment and learn to exploit it maximally for the conditions under which it has to operate? And that's, I think, what the Armed Forces is challenged with, because although they say that we must, that the Indian Air Force must be able to narrow down to a much lesser number or type of aircrafts, these things are easier said than done in the perspective of 2030 and so on, because we can't just put the clock back and there will be obvious difficulties. So one of the things is, question which you can ask about some of the suggestions is it possible, is it feasible, is it practicable? That may be a challenge.
So they seem to be suggesting a broad direction, and at least on maritime domain, we don't have huge disagreements.
No, we don't have. I think that's an area where we should actually speed up. Whatever cooperation that they are saying is absolutely works for us and works for them.
Yeah, of course, rationalizing, as they call it, the Air Force is one of those things which I'm sure will face resistance.
You see, I think one of the points which it makes about it talks about is organizational changes. Okay, but I think it's missed the basic organizational changes which require to be done. It is talked about integrated commands, and it talks about 2 maritime commands. It talks about a Northern Theatre Command, which is a good idea. I mean, that's not in dispute. But what they miss out completely is about the integration required of the armed forces with the Ministry of Defense. Because all this will be difficult if you don't have that higher level of integration. And that's a point which is not covered at all in this report, and I think that's been missed out.
I think they're very focused on the US-India relationship there, and they make recommendations about how US can help India with these specific capabilities. Manoj?
Yeah, I mean, that is a broad focus, right? What the US can do. And I think General Menon has covered most of the things that they speak about, like from joint development of weapon systems to information sharing. They propose something called a US, France, India trilateral information and intelligence sharing mechanism for the Indian Ocean region. I mean, I wanted to sort of talk to you a little bit about this connection that you made between the maritime domain and the land boundary, where the fact that the maritime domain is where the real competition will essentially be played out. There was a chapter that we discussed in a podcast earlier, which was written by John Garver, where he essentially says that the conflict in the maritime domain, or this push and pull between India and China, where India sort of not just builds up its capabilities, but also acts as sort of a spoiler for China in the Indian Ocean region, will potentially lead to a conflict on the land boundary, which is where the Chinese will try and sort of initiate some sort of a punitive assault on India, where the political objective is essentially to have a short, quick conflict, which sort of brings India to heel in the maritime domain. sort of a lesson in that domain to be taught here. That was the argument that John Garver was making, that is a kind of conflict that we can anticipate in the near future, not necessarily from a political objective of settling the land boundary or capturing territory, because doing that would be very difficult. In that context, is that something that we can see as a potential threat, given as India sort of competes more vigorously in the maritime domain?
Now, we are actually talking about which has got greater deterrence capability, the loss of territory on the northern borders, or our ability to actually interfere with the sea lanes of communications in the maritime zone. So actually, this is a generalized question. Now, we'll have to actually put it into a context of a political situation which has to this thing. Both have their pluses and minuses. Let's say if the Chinese actually come through between where Doklam is and actually cut off our northeast, that will be a major territorial challenge for us. Would therefore we be in a position to affect China in the maritime domain, and would that have an impact on what the Chinese would do? Some would actually argue that the Chinese can actually last us out for maybe 3 months. The sea lanes of communications, they have the reserves. So where is this going to be? I think, if you want to just look at it from that point of view, then probably you would find that the maritime domains has its limitations, because how can you stop the flow of trade? Because it is not only China which is using that, it is an international community. So it is much more complicated doing anything here than in the space which is there, which is purely bilateral between us, and probably only Bhutan would probably be involved. So there is a issue which makes it more difficult to do that. But that doesn't mean that even the threat of doing so won't affect Chinese calculations about what they will initiate in the north. I mean, it cannot be divorced from the two. And we simply do not know how much this effect is. But the fact is, this is the advantage India has, and there is a particular advantage which the Chinese has. Territorial, let's say, loss is a great psychological blow to any country. Can that be compensated by a loss in the flow of trade? Maybe the territorial loss would probably have a greater. Because we are now just thinking that this is purely a Sino-Indian problem, that this war is being waged. We are not even discussing what this war is being waged for. What does China wants us to do? So, when you talk in these independent thing, you lose sight of what is the power of each, what is the deterrence power of each of these. So it's not very easy to say that this would be in what it says is from our point of view, our defensive ability in the north must be as strong as it is, and our ability to actually project power in the maritime domain is what will really make a difference. So we haven't talked about how China now brings our western neighbor Pakistan into play, and we can't really talk now between a Sino-Indian conflict without having Pakistan in the room. So the question then is, how does a power like the United States and so on, what sort of a role does it play? And the paper says that India, nor the Americans expect to actually have any direct involvement if there is a conflict between. The question is, what sort of indirect involvement is the Americans came to play, apart from the normal intelligence sharing and so on, which will be of this thing. Is there some other type of pressure which Americans can try to bring onto either China or maybe onto Pakistan? That the paper actually does not cover. But it makes the point that do not expect, and I'm surely we do not expect to. And we agree with that we do expect that the Chinese will come and bail us out in a Sino-Indian conflict. That's not going to happen.
Okay, so it would seem that while this paper has some interesting operational concepts, it really doesn't address the political context in which any such India-China conflict or crisis may take place. All right, thank you so much for this discussion, General Menon, Manoj.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on All Things Policy.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Look! Up in the internet! It's a meme! No! It's a cat video! No! It's the Geek Fruit Podcast!
That's right, we interrupt this riveting broadcast to tell you about our show, The Geek Fruit Podcast, where Tejas, Dinkar, and I, Jishnu, talk about everything in pop culture, including DC, Marvel, Star Wars, Netflix, and everything in between.
You know how your friends hate it when you ramble about some nerdy crap and you just want somebody to listen to you? Well, sorry, there's nothing we can do about that, but come listen to us ramble and it'll almost be like the real thing. Kind of.
Listen to new episodes of the Geek Fruit Podcast every Monday and the Geek Fruit Bulletin every Thursday on iTunes, Google Podcasts, the IVM app, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Happy listening, you nerds.
Do you wish you were smarter? Well, so do we. But the next best thing?
We could make you sound smarter.
And to help you with this endeavor, we are Simplified, a podcast that attempts to break down the complex world around you with a little knowledge, a lot of poor jokes, and a ton of random trivia.
Episodes out every Monday
On the IVM Podcast app or wherever you get your podcasts.
See ya!